Senator Hume has submitted a proposal under Standing Order 75 today. It's shown at item 12 on today's order of business. Is the consideration of the proposal supported? Thank you, Senators. With the concurrence of the Senate, the clerks will set the clock in line with informal arrangements made by the whips, and I call Senator Hume.
Thank you, Madam President. In June 2022, now Minister Tony Burke told the Australian people with a straight face, people will be seeing in their bank accounts what a change of government means. People will be seeing in their bank accounts a wage increase. Now, in April 2022, the then opposition leader laid it down. He said, "I'll say this very clearly. They," and he was referring to Australians, "they will be better off under a Labor government than they will be under a Morrison government." Now, 2 years later, we can see absolutely how hollow these promises have been. Australians, on every measure, are worse off under a Labor government. Now, that is an opinion, that's facts. Just today, we saw the wage price index released, and again there was another quarter of real wages going backwards. In fact, real wages have gone backwards by 9% since Labor came to government. And just in my home state of Victoria, which has been economically so mismanaged by the Andrews and Allen governments for years and years now, the ultimate canary in the coal mine for Labor economic mismanagement. In my home state of Victoria, they have recorded the lowest wage growth, just a 0.1% WPI increase. That is against far higher inflation. Victorians' wages are going backwards faster than anyone else in Australia. Last week, the ABS told us that the cost of living indexes continue to rise, 6.2% for working Australians. And at the same time, the cost of food has gone up by 11%, housing prices have gone up by 15%, rent has increased by 15%, electricity has surged 22% and gas prices have jumped 25%. Now, these aren't just numbers. They represent the daily struggles of Australians trying to make ends meet. That not only are Australians doing it tough, and anybody that tells us, "Oh, it's just about cutting back on your takeaway coffees," you could not be further out of touch. It's parents in regional and rural areas that are pulling their kids out of Saturday sports because they can't afford to drive between towns. It's small businesses who are shutting their doors, not selling their businesses, but just shutting their doors and walking away because they can't afford to operate. It's getting harder and harder for Australians, but after 2 years it's clear that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Labor simply do not get it. It's a government that promised the world. You'll recall the $275 reduction in your energy bills, and promises for more affordable mortgages to ease the cost of living. All of this has been broken. All of it has been abandoned. And instead of taking the hard decisions, like those that Australians are taking around their kitchen tables every single night about their own budgets, instead Labor Prime Minister and his Treasurer are falling back on spin. They're trying to fight the symptoms. They're not trying to fight the cause of the cost of living crisis. The Prime Minister insists that his policies are bringing inflation down, but that is just a lack of assessment of reality. Just last week he said his budget measures were designed to put downward pressure on inflation. But at the Cost of Living Committee, the chief economist at the RBA said to me that in terms of being a sustained return to target, that's not something that we can see coming from those particular policies, because they're only designed and legislated for 1 year. So by their nature, they're time-limited and they're temporary. So anybody that bothers to pick up the statement of monetary policy can see this. After a dip, which has been described by economists as artificial, they described it as smoke and mirrors, inflation will in fact be higher again the following year, nearly a full percentage point higher. The Prime Minister's detachment from reality on this issue makes the challenges even more daunting, but the Treasurer has followed suit, because on the same day that the chief economist of the RBA told the committee that the economy was running a bit hot, the very same day the Treasurer said, "I think it's hard to sustain an argument that the economy is running too hot." Well, that's a direct contradiction of the independent RBA. The Treasurer and his team are so far out of their economic depth, and they've taken to criticising the independent RBA rather than listening to their advice. There is so much that this government could be doing to alleviate the cost of living pressures, but instead they're trying to sell you a pup. They're trying to sell you a pup that their high inflation, that their high expenditure, that their higher levels of taxation are in fact good for you. But Australians are poorer. They are worse off under Labor. It's not that you're feeling poorer, you in fact are poorer.
Thank you, Senator Hume. Senator Green.
Thank you, President. Well, on this side of the chamber, our government is clearly focused on delivering cost of living relief because we understand that Australians are doing it tough. We understand that this is a tough time for families, and that is why we have been delivering that cost of living relief. But no amount of cherry-picked figures from those opposite can ever make this untrue. Every step of the way, every measure of cost of living relief that we have delivered to Australians, those opposite have opposed. We have made sure that every single taxpayer is getting a tax cut, not just some. And those on the opposite side opposed it before we'd even released the details. They opposed even the lowest paid workers getting a tax cut. On this side of the chamber, we're making sure that every household gets energy bill relief. And in my home state of Queensland, what that means is that every single household is getting a $1,300 power bill relief. But nothing that those on the other side say can undo the fact that they voted against this relief. They're crying out for the government to do something, but when we deliver a plan and bring it to this parliament, they vote against it. Our government has ensured that low-paid workers are getting their third consecutive pay rise. You're going to hear a lot of information on the other side about wage increases and data. Well, that data matters to low-paid workers. 2.6 million of them will be getting a pay rise because of our government. And yet, no matter what information those opposite bring along to this chamber today, nothing will make untrue the fact that they had a policy in place for years to put pressure on wages and to keep wages low, and that was built into their design of this economy. When it comes to things like stronger Medicare, they're opposed to that as well. When it comes to cheaper medicines, they opposed cheaper medicines. When it comes to dealing with making sure that we can build more homes more quickly in every part of the country, well, those opposite have teamed up with the Greens to vote against that type of legislation. And so when it comes to the cost of living relief that our government is delivering, whether it's tax cuts, whether it's wage rises, whether it's more money for childcare workers, whether it's cheaper childcare and keeping fees under pressure, cheaper Medicare, cheaper medicines, making sure that we have urgent Medicare clinics in all parts of the country, these are measures that those opposite oppose. And so when they come in here and crow about cost of living and how tough people are doing it, the question to ask Peter Dutton and those opposite is, what are they doing about it? Because every time we've given the LNP a chance to vote for cost of living relief, they have voted against it. Because they're not interested in helping Australians. They're not interested in delivering cost of living relief to the lowest paid workers. They're interested in having a debate about it, but when given a chance, they vote against it. And actually, what we have seen from those opposite in the last couple of weeks are plans for higher taxes and higher power prices. We've seen plans from those opposite to cut back increases in the pension. They're talking about lower wages through opposing all of the changes that we've put in place. It is clear that under our government, you have a government and a Prime Minister committed to cost of living relief. Every step of the way, our announcements have been carefully calibrated to put pressure on inflation, but to deliver important cost of living relief to Australians. Whether it's making sure that an early childhood educator who I met some of them in Cairns this week. Because of the announcement we made on Friday, they will have an extra $100 in their account, and it is a 15% pay rise for those hard-working, low-paid, highly feminised workforce. That's what happens when you have a government focused on cost of living relief. What we've seen from those opposite at every step of the way is a plan to say no and to oppose cost of living relief and yet complain about it at the same time. We are not interested in that. We're getting on with the job and we're focused on cost of living.
Green, Senator McKim.
People who are worried about the cost of existing, the cost of just simply staying alive these days, need to know that they're not alone. Across Australia, millions of people are feeling a massive squeeze, whether it's rent payments, whether it's mortgage payments, whether it's transport costs, whether it's power bills, or whether it's just simply putting food on the table. And the truth is, we're all being ripped off by big corporations who are making obscene profits while they pay next to nothing in tax. Remember, 1 in 3 of the top 100 earning corporations in Australia pay absolutely no tax whatsoever. And where are the establishment parties, the Labor Party, the Liberal Party and the Nationals? Well, they are actually too busy taking millions in political donations from those very same corporate giants to stand up for the millions of Australians who are getting smashed at the moment. And let's be real about this. If the establishment parties, if the Labor and Liberal Party were going to fix this, they would have done it by now. Now, the Greens don't take those donations because we are here to fight for people, not for corporate profits. We want to tackle these greedy corporations head on and use their obscene profits to fund the things that will actually help Australians to make ends meet. We're talking about putting in place a freeze on rent increases. We're talking about stopping the banks from ripping people off on their mortgage repayments. We're talking about making it illegal for the supermarket corporations to price gouge. We're talking about busting up the supermarket duopoly so that food and groceries become cheaper in Australia. But here's the thing. Change will not happen on its own. Change will only happen if Australians vote for it. And if you think things are going okay at the moment, by all means, keep voting for the Labor or Liberal parties. But heed this warning. You can't keep voting for the same old parties and expect a different result. If you want change, you have to vote for it. And change is on the way and it is available to us in Australia. Support for the old parties is collapsing, support for the Greens is rising, and we are here to look after people, not corporate interests.
Thank you, Senator McKim. Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, President. There is no question Australians are going backwards under the Albanese Labor government due to their homegrown cost of living crisis, and that is the sad reality. Now, those opposite have just tried to say, oh, don't you worry about those cherry-picked figures, they're not really relevant. Well, those cherry-picked figures are from the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Australian Treasury, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. They are the facts. They're not just something that have been pulled from the back of the garden somewhere. And what do those facts actually tell us? That since those opposite came into government, prices have increased by more than 10% for food, housing, rent, electricity, gas, health, education and insurances. Sadly, that is not the least of it. And if that is not bad enough, at the time cost of living is increased, real wages under this government have gone backwards by 7.8%, meaning Australian purchasing power, the family budgets, are under double pressure. And sadly,
Yet there is no light at the end of this dismal Labor tunnel for Western Australia, from where I represent, for householders who are struggling to pay for the basics. Core inflation, driven by Labor's bad policies, not something that's just somehow happened on its own, is stubbornly high, with the latest quarterly core inflation data coming in at 3.9%. Our inflation is now higher than any other advanced economy. So it's not just something as those opposite try to say, oh, well, it's happening in the rest of the world. It is not. It is happening here in a way that it is not happening in any other advanced economy. In fact, since December this year, Australia is the only G10 nation where core inflation is actually accelerating. So none of this nonsense that, well, this is just something from somewhere else. So the Reserve Bank told the Cost of Living Committee this week that without the government reducing their radical spending, they cannot consider cutting rates. And in fact, they might still have to increase interest rates, which would be a catastrophe for Australian mortgage holders. So the RBA still does have its foot on the economic brakes, but the ALP government, sadly, still have their foot firmly put on the accelerator. We've seen this with their last 3 failed budgets, spending an additional, wait for this, $315 billion at a time when economic restraint is needed. Hard-working Australians, including Western Australians, have endured 12 interest rate hikes, and the prospect of any mortgage release is looking less likely every day Labor remains in government. Now, if you'll remember, it was only 2.5 years ago that Labor promised everybody's life would be easier and cheaper under their leadership. But despite all of their prolific spending, life is getting worse by the day for average Australians. But what's of most concern also, well, maybe equally of concern to other Australians, is that while they are suffering under a cost of living crisis in every aspect of their family budget, the Prime Minister and Labor have not been focusing on that. They've been focusing on spending $500 million on the failed Voice referendum, putting all their eggs in one basket with their renewable-only policy, attacking our WA sheep industry. And just this week we've seen the effects of their most recent IR changes, where unions are holding our own states, in this case now Western Australian businesses, to ransom. The unions are now running riot again at BHP mining sites, the Labor have allowed them to begin bargaining agreements without the majority support of workers on WA mines. Labor have allowed the unions to run riot over our mines without the support of the majority of workers, which is taking us back now to the dark old days that I had hoped, and I know every single West Australian worker had hoped would never, ever return. Industry stakeholders have raised their deep concerns, raising the alarm about the significant negative impacts it will have on our critical WA mining industry, which keeps the rest of the nation in jobs, in schools, with health support and all of the other services we require. It is time to get rid of this government and bring good government and good governance back.
Senator Smith. Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and the Treasurer Dr Chalmers have some explaining to do. They need to explain to Australian households why are they living through a cost of living crisis, and they need to explain to Australian businesses why they are now living through a cost of doing business crisis. Prior to the election, just 2 years ago, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, as the opposition leader, made a promise. He said that Australians would be better off under Labor. He said they would be better off when it comes to their mortgage repayments, their cost of living. And in fact, 2 years into this government, just 2 years into this government, the country has seen, again, the poor economic management of Labor. So why is it that Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, and Dr Tim Chalmers, the Treasurer, have chosen to make Australians poorer? because running the economy is something that the government consciously does. The Prime Minister gets up in the morning, the Treasurer gets up in the morning, and if we're to believe Labor senators, this is their top priority. This is the thing that they are consumed the most about. Well, then why is it that their decisions and their actions are making businesses poorer and families poorer? Just last week at the Senate Cost of Living Inquiry in Sydney, it was revealing. It was revealing. The Deputy Governor of the RBA, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, made it very clear. Dr Hunter said, "We just think the economy is running a little bit hotter than we thought previously, and as a result of that, we think it's a bit longer for inflation to get back to target." The economy is running a little bit hotter, said the RBA Deputy Governor. And guess who is feeling the heat of that? Guess who is feeling the heat of that? Australian families, through higher inflation, higher interest rates, and businesses now, as many of them begin to go to the wall. Just today, the Westpac Bank released some very interesting data and commentary on the performance of the Australian economy. It had this to say. Reflecting on consumer sentiment, Westpac said, consumer sentiment dipped 1.1% in July, remaining the deeply pessimistic range that has dominated for 2 years now. Westpac saying that consumer sentiment is now in the deeply pessimistic range, a range that has dominated for 2 years. It goes on to say, when reflecting on the plight of young Australians who want to get into their first home, Westpac said today, around housing, home buyer sentiment sank back to new lows, but consumer price expectations cooled. Nationally, the index has been at extremely weak levels, at or below the 80 mark for 2.5 years now, easily the most sustained period of depressed home buyer sentiment over the history of the survey. Westpac, don't believe me, Westpac says that the sentiment of aspirational first home buyers is now depressed and at a historic low. And of course, the pain is being felt in households, and now it's being felt in small businesses. Just this month, ASIC released its most recent report into small business insolvencies. It revealed that 11,000 businesses have gone insolvent in the last 12 months. In my home state of Western Australia, that figure is 1,079 businesses insolvent in the last 12 months. And the alarming figure is, unfortunately, this one, that 379 WA businesses went insolvent in the June quarter alone. 1 in every 7 hours. One business in every 7 hours went insolvent. The record of the government is clear. Australians are being punished by Labor. They deserve to know why Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, and Dr Jim Chalmers want to make their life so hard for them. In my home state of Western Australia, the WA Labor Party said it would back West Australians. It has not backed West Australians. It has made their life harder, it has made businesses poorer, and the country is worse off, is poorer, because of this Labor government.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you. The actual rate of inflation, or more accurately the Consumer Price Index, represents how much cost of living has changed in the previous quarter and over time. To measure the CPI change, the Australian Bureau of Statistics uses a basket of goods and services that should fairly represent the purchases of average Australian household would make. Incremental changes are made to the measure every few years to take into account changes in household spending patterns. After many years of adjustments, chops and changes, the question now arises, how relevant is the CPI calculation to the lives of working Australians? Mortgages have become a massive expense, rising 45% across the 12 interest rate rises that have occurred under the Anthony Albanese Labor government. Yet housing is only 13% of the inflation basket for households, no matter how high your mortgage or rent goes. In part, this is because the spending pattern that sets the weightings is taken from 2022, before Labor's inflation actually set in. The weighting in the basket given to holidays and recreation has increased to 12.1%. This is interesting, because holidays were really expensive during COVID, and then as the economy reopened, the cost came back down. Increasing the weighting for holidays has acted to reduce the inflation rate artificially. How accurate is that? Who can afford expensive holidays in the current cost of living crisis? In creating a system that relies on spending patterns that may be years old or fails to reflect the main demographic, working families, the ABS is failing to accurately reflect cost of living increases as households feel the pain right now. And governments can fudge the figures. Government subsidies on energy, for instance, reduce the inflation rate for energy, even though consumers are paying the full bill themselves, either through their wages or through tax. Inflation should be expressed before government cover-up payments, not after. One Nation will return to this topic next week on behalf of Australian working families.
Senator O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. And I come to this debate at a point where I've heard a couple of contributions of those before me, and it still surprises me here in the Senate that there seems such glee from those opposite as they describe what we know is a pretty challenging time for Australian people. Like when we say the line, we know Australians are doing it tough, I mean we actually really do know. It's been tricky. But let's be clear about a couple of things. We need to get some facts on the record. Instead of the glee and delight in the challenges that people face and heaping the misery on top of that by putting out incorrect facts, I want the Australian people, those listening to this debate, to know that the Labor Party wants you to earn more and we want you to keep more of what you earn. That's what matters to people, managing your own finances for yourself and your family. We understand that. We have to manage all of the terms, that the economic language that goes around in this debate, which can be so off-putting for people. They just stop listening. But we do have to get some facts right around that complex economic debate. So there is some good news. And this is what Australians need to hear. They need to hear hope. They need to hear that a Labor government under Anthony Albanese is hopeful for them and working for a better future. So it's important to note that in contrast with the topic for debate that's been put up here at the MPI, that new data released today by the Australian Bureau of Statistics actually shows that annual real wages are growing under the Albanese Labor government. Now, they're not growing as quickly as everybody would like. We'd all like our pay packets to be bigger all of the time, but they're growing. And that contrasts really, really markedly with what we saw under the previous government. There was no effort at all to increase the wages of ordinary working Australians. Now, in addition to the wages that Australians take home every week and that they use to balance their budget, to pay their rent or to pay their mortgage and to get their kids the things that they need, we've also made sure that while Australians are struggling, we just don't leave them hanging. And we don't delight in their misery. In fact, what we have made sure is that we've given cost of living assistance while people are struggling to help them through this tricky time. Now, one of the really important things was the tax cuts. Now, people will have had a look at their salary, their wages that have come in since the 1st of July, and that has led to a change for the 13.6 million working Australians who are getting a tax cut this year. Now, the average tax cut is $1,888 just in the year 2024 to 25. It's not enough to get you to buy a house, but it's enough to help you make ends meet. It's a beginning of support for people, encouraging people to be able to get on with their life knowing that their government is going to support them. And if we had left the package of stage 3 tax cuts as those opposite had designed it, fewer would have been able to bank those benefits. 11.5 million taxpayers, or 84% of Australians, got a bigger tax cut on the 1st of July this year because Labor is listening, because Labor cares about ordinary Australians in their financial challenges, because we won't leave you hanging. We've increased the Medicare levy for low-income thresholds, and there's energy relief to make sure that all 10 million households across this country are going to have $300 rebated from their bill. So when the bill comes in, $75 a quarter is going to be removed because the government, the Albanese government, will not leave you hanging. We will support you. We believe in benefiting all Australians, using the power of government alongside people's own endeavours in their interest and their efforts for their families. The Labor government wants you to earn more, keep more of what you earn, and will help you through the difficult times.
The time for the discussion has expired. The Senate will now consider the proposal from Senator Van, which is also shown at item 12 on today's order of business. Is consideration of this proposal supported? Righto. With the concurrence of the Senate, the clerks will set the clock in line with the informal arrangements made by the whips. And I call Senator Van.
Thank you. And I rise to address a matter of critical importance, our sovereign defence manufacturing industry. As global threats escalate, Australia's preparedness is alarmingly inadequate. Yet we continue to retreat from the vital support that sovereign defence manufacturing provides, leaving us dangerously exposed. The urgency of our situation cannot be overstated. The decisions made by the Minister for Defence Industry are destroying our defence manufacturing sector at a time our circumstances demand a resurgence. The National Defence Strategy emphasises that a sovereign defence, and I quote, a sovereign defence industrial base is vital for developing higher levels of military preparedness and self-reliance. However, the very many defence manufacturers I speak with express only concern that the Minister's actions favour overseas defence industries over our own. A stark example of this is his recent decision to purchase the US-made Switchblade 300 strike drone, a blow to the many and wonderful drone manufacturers that have this capability nationally. This is a plea for foresight, for preparation and investment in our national security. The war in Ukraine has starkly demonstrated the dangers of relying on foreign supply chains for weapons. While Australia will always need to import high-end platforms, there are many weapons and munitions that we could and should be producing domestically to build resilience. This must be addressed urgently. The Australian Industry and Defence Network reports that orders to Australian defence manufacturing companies have plummeted by 30%. The defence industry employs 64,000 Australians and contributes $10.6 billion in gross value added, a vital component of not just our security, but of our economy. In the previous financial year alone, $4.4 billion was awarded through foreign military sales, that is, purchase of Australian defence material from foreign governments. We have nearly 3,000 companies in Australia with defence-related capabilities, yet most are left to compete for scraps alongside foreign companies working here. This is not how we build a resilient and sovereign defence industry. And adding to this concern, we have committed over $9 billion to fund the expansion of American and British shipyards that will build our submarines. While this expenditure is necessary, I must ask, where is the support for our industry? The strategic implications of our under preparation are clear. The Defence Strategic Review and the National Defence Strategy Both underscore the necessity of sovereign defence manufacturing, particularly in the production of weapons and munitions. But the government has allocated only $150 million in the Defence Industry Development Strategy over 4 years, averaging a paltry $37.5 million annually. This funding represents only 0.7% of Australia's total defence budget. The recently announced Future Made in Australia initiative is going to make a significant contribution to strengthening Australia's economy through domestic manufacturing. But defence is not listed as a priority sector, even though the framework sets out that it's for economic resilience and security. Designating sovereign defence manufacturing as a priority sector is essential to ensuring that Australia can independently produce and maintain military equipment, munitions and technologies. The Future Made in Australia commitment by Prime Minister Albanese is commendable. However, it could do much more, like funding our onshore defence manufacturing. We must prioritise defence manufacturing to ensure Australia is equipped to navigate the complexities of an increasingly unstable world. Thank you.
Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I rise to support this motion by Senator Van, and in doing so, in talking about the importance of the production of defence capability by Australian industry as being a critical enabler not only to our military capability in times of war, but also as a deterrent factor to dissuade potential adversaries from taking action, because they know we have both the capability and the will to respond. In that context, it's important to realise that we're not talking in abstracts here. The Defence Strategic Update of 2020, the Defence Strategic Review of 2023, both highlighted that Australia no longer has the 10-year warning time to major conflict in our region that for decades governments have worked to. And in fact, alliance partners and others in the region have highlighted that they believe the peak threat in our region is indeed around the 2028-29 timeframe, and there are calls from both Europeans and North Americans to be ready in that timeframe. When it comes to supporting defence industry, though, we need to move beyond the rhetoric. And when we see the Albanese government's defence industry development strategy, it is full of rhetoric which is not matched by the contractual commitments that will allow Australian companies to continue to invest in their people and in their facilities and their productive capacity. And those contracts are important. If we go to the recent NATO meeting in Washington, where Jens Stoltenberg and other heads of governments from Europe and North America came together, and they were calling for an increase in the production capacity of industry in Europe and the States, I was struck by the comment of the Defence Minister from Estonia. And what he highlighted was that what industry was saying to him was that unlike Russia, where President Putin can turn any factory into a defence factory at the will of government, in a democracy, industry needs contracts. Industry needs contracts if they are to take the decisions to invest in people and equipment and IP to actually produce the things that a nation needs. And so one of my concerns with the defence industry strategy that we see from the Albanese government is that when it comes to defence industry development, they again largely default to grant programs. And so you can have a look at where they offer grants as opposed to contracts for actual equipment. And I contrast that, for example, with a Queensland company called Sea Transport, who've developed a stern-loading vessel which they sell into the civilian market, and the US Marine Corps, when they look at it, go, that could suit our purpose, we will give you a contract, we'll lease one for 3 years so we can trial it and see if this will fit our need to actually equip a fleet with it. And so they find ways of actually giving contracts to companies, in this case even an Australian company, where so often the Australian government prefers to look overseas as opposed to dealing directly with Australian companies for critical capability. And we see that the Defence Strategic Review by the Albanese government has not only brought in a 2-year delay to the development of some of our critical capabilities, but their concept of no configuration change and minimum viable capability means that even where Australian industry has developed world-leading capabilities, and I think here of the anti-ship missile defence capability that is delivered by the Australian CFAR radar by the CEA company and the 9LV combat system by the Adelaide-based Saab, that is better than anything, for example, the Americans can deliver. That will not be on our future fleet of general-purpose frigates. And so despite the Australian taxpayer helping to fund these capabilities, what we see is the Albanese government deciding to purchase offshore and ignore the long-term investment that has built up these capabilities, and companies will not survive without contracts, and they will not invest in new capability without contracts. And so when we look at things like the lessons of Ukraine, the fact we need multiple platforms that are affordable, to some extent expendable, and armed, I'm appalled by the announcements recently that the MQ-28 Loyal Wingman, which is envisaged to have both communications, ISR and weapons, the Defence Industry Minister said, yeah, weapons will come down the track. If we believe that strategic circumstances are real, arm the Loyal Wingman, the Ghost Bat, now.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett. Senator Shoebridge.
Thanks, Acting Deputy. This motion calls for an Australian sovereign defence manufacturing industry. And it's ignoring perhaps the elephant in the room, that when it comes to defence expenditure, the single largest defence expenditure proposed is under AUKUS Pillar 1 and to some extent under AUKUS Pillar 2, which is seeing hundreds of billions of dollars of Australian taxpayers' money, public money, spent on weapons systems and investment in industries entirely offshore in an historically dangerous gamble. And we saw that yesterday when we got the AUKUS 2.0 agreement finally tabled. And what did that show? Well, that showed that for this $368 billion gamble for US, UK, potentially at some point partly Australian nuclear submarines, that both the US and the UK have put into that agreement multiple get-out-of-jail-free cards. And the Albanese government has put us on the hook to indemnify both the US and the UK governments if something goes wrong, perhaps a catastrophic accident with a second-hand sub. Who pays for that? Not the United States, but Australian taxpayers. And the US and the UK will set the price for including the enriched uranium they're going to sell us. And they take away any independent consultation Australia has with the International Atomic Energy Agency. I've never seen such an irresponsible, one-sided agreement signed by an Australian government, and every aspect of the agreement is a blow to Australian sovereignty. And don't take my word for it, this is what it says. Article 1 of the agreement, at the end of it, says that either if the US or the UK determines that such cooperation with Australia will constitute an unreasonable risk to their defence and security, that they don't have to do it. If it constitutes an unreasonable risk to the defence or security of the UK or the US, they don't have to do it. Article 4H is an extraordinary provision. It says that Australia can make payments of appropriated funds to the US or the UK for the purpose of implementing the agreement, but there's not a single provision in AUKUS 2.0 for the US or the UK to pay a single dollar to Australia. It's not even envisaged that they may pay for some of it to Australia. The only provision is for us to give money to them, and we've already started doing it. Some $5 billion to the US for their sovereign capacity, some $5 billion to the UK for Rolls-Royce and their capacity, but it doesn't even contemplate that there might be a dollar flowing the other way. Article 13 says that at any point the US or the UK or Australia can terminate the agreement with 1 year's notice, and then it says we have to give everything back. Every single thing gets returned. The subs, the technology, the information. And do you know how much we get in return when we hand over all the stuff that Australia has paid maybe tens and tens of billions of dollars for? Not 1 cent. They can terminate it on 1 year's notice. get all their stuff back, and we don't get a cent. Who would sign this stuff? And if you want to see the last bit, it's the understanding that's attached to it. Some private understanding, now public because we forced it upon them, and that says the final word in these agreements is that the UK and the US expressly say that they don't have to do anything if it will adversely affect the ability of the United States or the United Kingdom to meet their respective military requirements, and they can stop if at any point it degrades their respective naval nuclear propulsion submarines. They can just stop. How much do we get back? Not 1 cent. That's not an agreement, that's a surrender. We sent Miles off to the United States to negotiate for a new bucket, and he came back with a sieve. It is extraordinary, with Minister Miles. And that's only Pillar 1. And that's only Pillar 1.
Point of order, Senator Ciccone.
As Senator Shoebridge acknowledged, I was raising a point of order to refer to members in the other place by their correct title.
That's right. Senators should refer to members with their correct titles, please.
Oh, sorry, Deputy Prime Minister. No one is allowed to call him Minister. Deputy Prime Minister. And then you have Pillar 2. Pillar 2 is actually probably even more insidious. Pillar 2 is the reason why Australia can't independently determine where they send weapons. Pillar 2 is the reason why we continue to send weapons into Israel, because Pillar 2 is designed to remove any sovereign capacity for Australia to determine its own defence industry and to determine its own defence policy. This is an extraordinary surrender of sovereignty. And if we're concerned about our defence, you should be concerned about ripping up AUKUS.
Thanks, Senator Shoebridge. Senator Ciccone.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. And I also want to rise to make a contribution to Senator Van's matter of public importance here in the Senate, particularly about the work that the Albanese Labor government is undertaking to deliver Australia's inaugural National Defence Strategy. And I also just wanted to note Senator Van's strong interest and commend him for his support of our ADF. I know he has a very strong interest and has, on many occasions now with the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, spent some time in estimates and other forums supporting our troops on the ground, and I just wanted to commend him on that. The Albanese Labor government regards the safety of Australians at its highest duty, and this includes defending our country, deterring potential threats and protecting Australia's economic connection to the world. And sadly, what we hear from the Australian Greens is the complete opposite, and not one of them is in the chamber at the moment to make a very useful contribution about how we, as a nation and as a parliament, do our duty about protecting our citizens. Therefore, I'm also very glad that this MPI has been placed on the agenda today, because federal Labor is serious about investing record amounts in defence industry to equip the men and women of the ADF with more advanced platforms in greater numbers sooner. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in the first year the Albanese government came to office in 2022-23, Australian defence industry rose by 4.1% and contributed $10.6 billion to our economy. Thanks to the government's increased spending, the number of people employed in defence industry also grew strongly by around 6%. Increasing our military capability is imperative now, more than ever, and we're boosting defence in a speedy manner with projects starting this decade. Central to a well-equipped ADF is the introduction of the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise last year. In this short time, the government has signed a $37.4 million contract with Lockheed Martin to manufacture missiles in Australia for next year, invested $220 million in the Commonwealth-owned munitions production factories, committed $1.6 billion to expand and accelerate the acquisition of long-range rocket systems for Army, committed $1.3 billion to provide Tomahawk cruise missiles for the Navy, and successfully integrated the latest naval strike missile and Standard Missile 6 on Navy warships. The government will also invest a total of $16 to $21 billion over the decade to establish munitions manufacturing in Australia, and that means local jobs. It's important to note that this government is taking decisive action to repair the damage of a decade of neglect by those opposite. The government has signed the single largest defence export in Australia's history,
exporting over 100 Boxer vehicles valued at $3.1 billion and securing over 600 direct jobs. And I know my colleague Senator Chisholm would be very happy with that result, given that he comes from Queensland, and there will be many jobs in Queensland that will benefit from that, as well as those in my home state of Victoria through the supply chain. Looking forward ahead, Federal Labor has also fast-tracked the delivery of the first new infantry fighting vehicle, the IFV, to 2027. Under the Coalition, that first vehicle was not scheduled until the late 2029. Under Labor, all 129 locally built redback IFVs will be delivered by the time the first vehicle would have been delivered under those opposite. The Albanese government is also accelerating the delivery of new surface combatants to the Navy. The first of these frigates will also be in service by 2029, followed by the first Hunter-class frigate in 2034. In stark contrast, those opposite proposed that the Navy had to wait until 2034 for its first new major combatant vessel. In the undersea domain, Federal Labor will deliver a Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarine in the early 2030s, while those opposite had no plans to deliver any new submarines until the late 2030s. Last month, the government brought forward the delivery of 18 medium landing craft for the Army by 2 years, so they arrive from 2026. This will create 1,100 direct jobs and more than 2,000 indirect jobs under a program that will also deliver 8 landing craft heavy 7 years earlier from the mid-2030s. And we've also announced investment into Australian industry to further develop the Ghost Bat, the first military aircraft designed and manufactured in Australia for more than 50 years. There is so much that this government has done, and I'm so proud of the work that the Albanese government is doing to support our ADF men and women.
Thank you, Senator Ciccone. Senator Lavey.
Thank you. I rise to support Senator Van's MPI. This country used to make things, tanks, aeroplanes, submarines. We used to have what they call sovereign defence capability. That means that we could make the things we needed to defend our country here in Australia. Now we have very little sovereign defence industry left. And by the way, I'm not counting those companies who say they are Australian just because they have officials here. The Coalition mainly sat on their hands for 9 years, and from what I hear, the current government is not doing much more. Actually, strike that, in some ways they are worse. For example, the AUKUS nuclear submarines that we're supposed to get by 2035 if we are lucky, and that's just one submarine. Under the AUKUS deal, the first thing the Australian taxpayer has been asked to do is hand over $10 billion, yes, $10 billion, to the US and UK submarine industrial base. How about that? Since 2009, the Australian government has wasted billions of dollars trying to decide on a replacement for the Collins-class submarines, which, by the way, were built here in Australia. Doesn't matter whether you think nuclear subs are a good idea or not, the AUKUS deal is both risky and eye-wateringly expensive. Both parties claim they take defence seriously because they spend lots of money. But spending buckets of money with little or nothing to show for it is not being serious about defence, let alone our national security. Here are some examples of past stuff-ups, because I don't have an hour. The C-271J Spartan battlefield transport airplanes, the result of a desktop selection, were found to be not well suited for battlefield operations and are now used as light transport. Then there was the Afura-class offshore combatant vessels, 12 vessels that Navy has since determined as unsuitable for intended maritime operations. And then there were the future frigates. Let's not go into that, I don't have enough time. These planned ships have got bigger and more expensive. The costs blow out, and project was slashed from 9 ships to 6, but at the same inflated price. And as I have said, these stuff-ups are not just in the past. At the last estimate hearing, senators were trying to find out how much of the taxpayers' $10 billion we'd get back if AUKUS didn't go ahead. Admiral Mead refused to answer Senator Shoebridge's question because it was apparently an irrelevant hypothetical, end quote. Now we know that the US and UK have an expensive free get-out-of clause, and all they have to do is give us 12 months' notice. You cannot be serious, you people in here. People are laughing at you. I tell you what, you could not run a corner shop between the both of you, and our national security is in the situation it's in because of you two. I can assure you, if you think those nuclear subs are going to help us tomorrow, I tell you what, wake up to yourselves.
Thank you, Senator Lambie. Senator Cadell.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. What a great motion this is before us, because of course it's about sovereignty over Australia and its defence industry. And sovereignty, when you get down to it, is the ability to make decisions without pressure from others. And that's what this country needs to be able to do, and it needs to be able to do strongly and definitively. And when we talk about defence industry, we talk about the very basics of that, being able to protect your own country from the threat of force of others. And having a homegrown ability to do that is essential. And this is what this talks about, spending some real money doing that. And there will always be systems that Australia can't build, top-end systems, complicated systems where we need our partners. And I get that, I accept that. But when we hear a press release that comes out and says a groundbreaking deal for what Senator Van put out, the Switchblade 300, you mentioned in his speech, which is essentially a long-distance hand grenade and nothing more than that, at $90,000 a piece from the United States, when we have a number of Australian businesses, not only to do the same but be able to do better. That is something that should have been brought here. It is not a game-changing technology that we couldn't take a risk on. That is something we should have done here. And this is what we see more and more, things painted as they aren't, opportunities going begging. And we talk about all the things we import, not enough money in Australian things, some things we can export. And I recently went to Lithgow and went through the Tallis factory there, one of the few significant barrel manufacturers there are around. We looked at their EF-88, replacing since 2016 the standard infantry weapon in Australia. And they pointed out that the British individual weapon, bullpup designs going, they're looking at an M4 copy, is up soon. And Britain does not have a barrel manufacturer capable to replace that. So investment and contracts in Australian defence capability, in certainty of keeping these guys going, of giving them a baseline, of giving them the confidence to go out there, would actually give Australia and Lithgow, a great economy out there, the chance to go out and take on the world and do stuff, provide things to our allies. That is what investment does. And we hear all the things that are being spent, we hear all the steps being taken, but what about the people that are in the industry? What are they saying the state of the Australian defence industry is? And a recent survey was commissioned by Defence Connect, and these are the stats. 47% of defence businesses believe it is difficult or extremely difficult to operate in the Australian defence sector. Now that's a percentage of people who are in it, not the people who looked at it and said, no, it's too hard, I won't even bother. This is a percentage of the people who actually took the step to get involved. 49% of defence businesses believe it is difficult or extremely difficult to attract and retain staff in the current environment because of that lack of certainty. This is all pointing a picture of not what previous government or this government says it is doing, it paints the industry of how the industry really finds it. No rubbish, the things that Senator Lambie was talking about, the reality on the ground, the chip shop, the corner shop mentality. And 1 in 4 defence businesses are extremely or very confident that their existing or upcoming contracts will continue as planned over the next 12 months. 12 months, not 12 years, not 10 years, not 5 years. 25% think they will go there. That's a disgrace. What we need to do is an integrated plan that has Australians able to build reasonable technology, good technology when we can. Things like GhostBat, don't take the weapons off it, let's reach for the tensions. What we've seen in Ukraine is you need a capability immediately to stop the initial threat, but it's no longer the doctrine of you finish a war with what you started with. You have the opportunity to build. You see innovations. They aren't using the Switchblade 300 greatly over there anymore. Russian Lancet comes in at about $20,000, about a third the cost. They're over there. They're using their homemade drones with improvised explosive devices. They're finding a way, because of necessity, to build a homegrown defence industry. Why aren't we learning that lessons? Maybe our industry is, but our Defence Department isn't taking the chance to put that money out there. The defence industry isn't being rewarded for having a crack. And that's why Senator Van's motion is so important. For Australia to have sovereignty, to be able to make its own decisions without being under pressure from others, we have to have the ability to defend ourselves in a very capable way. Little things we could be doing now. We talk about the armaments round. There's a worldwide demand for 155 military shells. We hear Ukraine losing a 2-to-1 artillery, 3-to-1 artillery deficiency. We can put contracts in place, help the world, build our industry and make Australia safe all in one if we take this seriously.
Thanks, Senator Cadell. Senator Roberts.
Thank you. I agree with Senator Van. Australia's defence preparedness is poor at best. And it's true that the best way to keep Australia strong is to keep our transport and industrial base strong. Instead, successive Liberal and Labor governments have presided over the destruction of our manufacturing base and allowed our ports and the transport into those ports to atrophy. One Nation proposes a comprehensive solution to this, starting with a railway from the Bowen Basin in the east of our country across to the Pilbara in the northwest, connecting to the existing network at the Port of Gladstone in Queensland and Pindar in West Australia. This will create a national rail network to allow Australian Defence Forces to access and to defend parts of our country we've never been able to access to stage a significant military operation. The railway, called Iron Boomerang, will enable an Australian steel industry to develop at Abbott Point near Townsville, returning to domestic production the most important elements of a defence industry: steel, aluminium, concrete and ceramics, and will allow an upgrade of the capacity of Townsville's military docks to offer bespoke repairs for domestic and military vessels, including our AUKUS allies. Having a strong steel industry will open the possibility of Australian armour, transport and military rolling stock, as well as a domestic strategic fleet offering economic benefit to Townsville, Newcastle, Williamtown and Port Adelaide. What would help as well is to not forget that our greatest strength is our love of this beautiful country. That will make us strong. One Nation will not apologise for loving Australia, for loving our flag, our language, our history and our culture. We are proud of our nation of Australia. We will proudly grow our manufacturing base to create wealth and security for all Australians.
The time for that discussion has expired.